What happens when one of America's most respected filmmakers sits down with a late-night host who thinks he knows better? You won't believe what unfolds when decades of artistic integrity clash with smug Hollywood commentary. Last night's episode of The Late Show delivered the kind of explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, and you're about to witness every uncomfortable moment. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Spike Lee faces off against Stephen Colbert in what started as a simple promotional appearance and ended in complete chaos. The tension was palpable from the moment Spike Lee walked onto the set. Fresh off the heels of his latest critically acclaimed film examining racial tensions in modern America, Lee had come to promote his work on what should have been a standard late-night appearance. But from the very first exchange, it was clear that Colbert had other plans. The host, known for his sometimes condescending interview style, seemed determined to challenge Lee's artistic choices rather than celebrate them. "So, Spike," Colbert began with that familiar smirk, "your new film tackles some pretty heavy themes about police brutality and systemic racism. Don't you think audiences are getting tired of being lectured to? I mean, can't we just enjoy movies anymore without all the political messaging?" Lee's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but those who knew his work could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. "Stephen, with all due respect, art has always been political. When you say people are tired of being lectured to, what you're really saying is that you're uncomfortable with black stories being told authentically." The audience fell silent. This wasn't the usual banter they expected from a late-night talk show. Colbert, clearly not expecting such a direct response, attempted to backtrack with his characteristic nervous laugh. "Well, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just wondering if there's a way to address these issues without being so aggressive about it." "Aggressive?" Lee leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising slightly. "You think telling the truth about black experiences in America is aggressive? You think showing the reality of what people face every day is too much for your audience to handle?" The host shifted uncomfortably, realizing he had stepped into dangerous territory. But instead of backing down, Colbert doubled down with a kind of privileged commentary that would soon ignite a firestorm. "Look, I'm not questioning your right to tell these stories. I'm just saying that maybe there's a more diplomatic way to address these issues. You know, something that brings people together instead of dividing them." Lee's jaw tightened. "Diplomatic? You want me to be diplomatic about murder? About injustice? About the systematic oppression of my people? Stephen, this is exactly the problem with liberal Hollywood. You want to feel good about yourselves without actually confronting the uncomfortable truths." The audience began to murmur, sensing the growing tension between the two men. Colbert, perhaps realizing he was losing control of the interview, attempted to steer the conversation in a different direction. "I think we're getting off track here. Let's talk about your creative process. How do you decide which stories to tell?" But Lee wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. "My creative process? My creative process is driven by the need to tell stories that matter. Stories that challenge people like you, who think they can dictate how black artists should express themselves. You sit here in your comfortable studio making jokes about politics, and then you have the audacity to tell me I'm being too aggressive when I show the reality of what's happening in this country." Colbert's face was beginning to flush red. The easy charm he usually relied on was nowhere to be found, as he struggled to maintain his composure. "I'm not trying to dictate anything," he said defensively. "I'm just offering a perspective as someone who's been in this business for a long time." "Been in this business?" Lee's voice dripped with disdain. "Stephen, you've been making jokes about serious issues for years. You've built your career on satirizing the very problems that are destroying communities, and now you want to lecture me about how to address racism? About how to make my art more palatable for your audience?" The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the usually supportive audience seemed unsure how to react to the escalating confrontation. Colbert, clearly rattled, made what would prove to be a critical error in judgment. Look, Spike, I respect your passion, but I think you're misunderstanding my point. I'm not some enemy here. I'm on your side. I vote Democrat. I support civil rights. I think we're actually fighting for the same things. If looks could kill, Colbert would have been a dead man. Lee's eyes narrowed to slits as he processed what he had just heard. You think because you vote Democrat and make jokes about Republicans that you're on my side? You think your performative liberalism gives you the right to tone police my art? The host attempted to interject, but Lee was just getting started. This is the problem with people like you, Stephen. You think that because you mock the obvious racists, you're somehow exempt from perpetuating the very systems you claim to oppose. You sit here in your ivory tower making millions off political comedy, and then you have the nerve to tell actual activists and artists that we're being too confrontational. Colbert's producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, clearly concerned about where this was heading. But their host, either oblivious to the warning signs or too proud to back down, pressed forward with what would prove to be a devastating miscalculation. I think you're being unfair, Colbert said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. I've used my platform to highlight these issues. I've had countless guests on to discuss racial inequality. I've donated money to civil rights organizations. I think I've proven that I'm committed to fighting racism. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Lee responded with the kind of righteous anger that had fueled his most powerful films. You've proven that you're committed to profiting off discussions about racism. There's a difference, Stephen. A big difference. As the tension reached a breaking point, it became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement about artistic expression. This was a fundamental clash between two worldviews, two approaches to addressing injustice, and two very different understandings of what it means to be an ally in the fight for racial equality. The stage was set for an explosion that would make television history, and neither man seemed willing to back down from the confrontation that was about to tear the interview apart completely. But what happened next would shock everyone in the studio, and cement this moment as one of the most explosive celebrity confrontations ever captured on live television. Colbert, perhaps sensing he was losing the narrative, made a calculated decision that would prove to be his biggest mistake of the evening. With cameras rolling and millions watching, he leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk and delivered what he clearly thought would be a knockout blow. You know what, Spike? I think you're being a little paranoid here. Not everything is about race. Sometimes a movie is just a movie. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The audience gasped audibly. Even the band members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lee sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his breathing measured and controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. Did you just tell me I'm being paranoid about racism? Lee's words cut through the silence like a blade. Did you really just sit there as a white man and tell me that my experiences with racism are paranoia? Colbert realized immediately that he had crossed a line, but his ego wouldn't let him retreat. That's not what I said. I'm just suggesting that maybe not every artistic choice needs to be viewed through a racial lens. Maybe sometimes you're seeing things that aren't there. The studio fell into a stunned silence. Even the production crew seemed frozen in place, unsure whether to continue rolling or cut to commercial. Lee slowly shook his head, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Seeing things that aren't there, Lee repeated, his voice dripping with disgust. Stephen, let me tell you something. I've been making films for over 3 decades. I've won Academy Awards. I've been recognized by film festivals around the world. And you're going to sit here and tell me that I'm imagining racism? The host tried to backtrack, but Lee was having none of it. You know what this is really about? You're threatened by authentic black voices. You're comfortable with black entertainers who make you laugh, who sing and dance for your amusement. But when we tell our real stories, when we show you the truth about what we face, suddenly we're being too aggressive, too confrontational, too paranoid. Colbert's face was now visibly flushed, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. I never said I was threatened by anything. I'm just trying to have a conversation here. A conversation? Lee's voice rose sharply. You call this a conversation? You've spent the last 10 minutes telling me how I should make my art, how I should address racism, how I should package my experiences to make them more palatable for your audience. That's not a conversation, Stephen. That's you trying to control the narrative. The tension in the studio was suffocating. Audience members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, and several could be seen whispering to each other. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was becoming an absolute disaster for the show. Colbert, perhaps realizing the gravity of his situation, attempted to inject some levity into the moment. Look, let's just take a step back here. We're both passionate about these issues. Maybe we can find some common ground. But Lee wasn't interested in finding common ground. Not anymore. Common ground? You just told me I'm paranoid about racism. You just suggested that my life's work is based on seeing things that aren't there. And now you want to find common ground? The filmmaker stood up from his chair, towering over the seated host. Let me tell you what I see, Stephen. I see a system that allows people like you to profit off discussions about racism while simultaneously dismissing the voices of those who actually experience it. I see a media landscape that celebrates white liberals who make jokes about obvious racists while silencing black artists who dare to tell uncomfortable truths. Colbert remained seated, perhaps hoping that staying in his chair would somehow de-escalate the situation. I think you're being unfair. I've given you a platform here tonight. I've allowed you to share your perspective. Allowed me? Lee's voice exploded with indignation. You've allowed me? Who the hell do you think you are? You think you're doing me some kind of favor by having me on your show? You think I need your permission to speak? The host immediately realized his poor choice of words. That's not what I meant. I just meant that we're providing a forum for discussion. A forum for discussion? Lee began pacing behind his chair, his hands gesturing emphatically. Is that what you call it when you spend the entire interview trying to tone police my art? When you tell me I'm being too aggressive, too confrontational, too paranoid? That's not a forum for discussion, Stephen. That's a platform for white liberals to feel good about themselves while dismissing authentic black voices. The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the confrontation unfolding before them. This was unlike anything they had ever seen on late-night television. The usual scripted banter had given way to raw, unfiltered emotion. Colbert, clearly desperate to regain control of the situation, made yet another critical error. I think you're attacking the wrong person here. I'm not your enemy. There are real racists out there doing real damage, and you're wasting your energy attacking someone who's actually trying to help. Lee stopped pacing and turned to face the host directly. Trying to help? You think what you're doing is helping? You think dismissing my experiences, questioning my artistic choices, and telling me I'm being paranoid is helping? The filmmaker's voice was trembling with rage. You want to know what's really dangerous, Stephen? It's not the obvious racists. It's people like you, people who think they're on the right side while perpetuating the very systems they claim to oppose. It's the liberal establishment that profits off black pain while telling us we're being too aggressive when we fight back. Colbert was clearly out of his depth now, struggling to maintain any semblance of control over the interview. I don't think that's fair. I've spent my career fighting against injustice. Fighting against injustice? Lee's laugh was bitter and humorless. You've spent your career making jokes about injustice. There's a difference, a big difference, and the fact that you can't see that difference is exactly the problem. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and it was becoming clear that there was no way back from this precipice. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every uncomfortable moment as two very different worldviews collided in spectacular fashion. What had started as a simple promotional appearance had devolved into something far more significant. A raw, unfiltered examination of race, privilege, and power in America. As the tension reached its absolute breaking point, it became evident that this interview was about to take an even more dramatic turn, one that would leave everyone in the studio speechless and create a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Colbert, in a last desperate attempt to salvage the interview, made what would prove to be his final and most devastating mistake. Rising from his chair to match Lee's standing position, he pointed his finger directly at the filmmaker and said, "You know what, Spike? I think you're being ungrateful. I've given you more time than any other guest tonight, and all you've done is attack me and my show. Maybe the problem isn't with how I'm asking the questions. Maybe the problem is with how you're answering them." The words hit Lee like a physical blow. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Colbert's finger, still pointed accusingly at him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades of experience and struggle. "Ungrateful." Lee's voice began to rise slowly like a gathering storm. "You think I should be grateful for being disrespected on national television? You think I should be grateful for having my life's work dismissed as paranoia? You think I should be grateful for being told how to make my art by someone who's never walked in my shoes?" The filmmaker took a step closer to the host, his presence commanding the entire stage. "Let me tell you something about gratitude, Stephen. I'm grateful for the ancestors who fought and died so I could have the opportunity to tell these stories. I'm grateful for the artists who came before me and paved the way. But I will never, ever be grateful for being told to tone down my voice to make white people comfortable." Colbert, realizing he had pushed too far, attempted to interrupt. "I didn't mean, don't you dare interrupt me!" Lee's voice boomed through the studio, causing several audience members to jump in their seats. "You've had your say. You've spent this entire interview talking down to me, dismissing my experiences, and now you have the audacity to call me ungrateful. No, Stephen, it's my turn to talk, and you're going to listen." The host immediately sat back down, clearly shaken by the intensity of Lee's response. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was becoming television history. "You want to know what's really ungrateful?" Lee continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his passion and anger. "What's ungrateful is using your platform to make millions off political comedy while dismissing the very people whose struggles you're joking about. What's ungrateful is sitting in your comfortable studio, surrounded by your predominantly white staff, and telling black artists that they're being too aggressive when they tell their truth." Lee began walking toward the edge of the stage, his movements deliberate and powerful. "You think because you mock Donald Trump and make jokes about Republican politicians that you're some kind of ally? You think your performative liberalism gives you the right to police how black people express their pain and their art?" The filmmaker turned back to face Colbert directly, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "I've been making films about these issues since before you even knew what a late-night talk show was. I've dedicated my entire career to telling stories that matter, to showing the world what it's really like to be black in America. And you have the unmitigated gall to sit there and tell me I'm being ungrateful?" Colbert attempted to speak, but Lee held up his hand, silencing him with a gesture. "No, Stephen, you've said enough. You've shown your true colors tonight. You've proven that for all your liberal posturing, for all your jokes about racism, when faced with authentic black anger, with real black pain, you can't handle it. You want us to be grateful for scraps, grateful for the opportunity to be dismissed and diminished on your show." The studio was completely silent now, the audience hanging on every word. Even the production crew seemed frozen in place, unsure whether to continue filming or cut to commercial. Lee walked back toward his chair, but instead of sitting down, he picked up his jacket from the back of the seat. "You know what I'm grateful for, Stephen? I'm grateful that this conversation happened on live television. I'm grateful that millions of people got to see exactly how white liberals really feel about black voices when we refuse to be polite and accommodating. He began putting on his jacket, his movements deliberate and dignified. I'm grateful that your audience got to witness what happens when someone like you is challenged by someone like me. When your comfortable worldview is confronted by uncomfortable truths. Colbert, clearly desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of the interview, stood up and attempted one final appeal. Spike, please, let's not end it like this. We can work through this. We can find a way to have a productive conversation. Lee paused mid-motion, looked at the host with a mixture of pity and disgust, and said, "A productive conversation? Stephen, this was a productive conversation. You just didn't like the product. You wanted me to smile and nod and promote my movie while you condescended to me. You wanted me to be grateful for the platform while you dismissed everything I had to say." The filmmaker finished putting on his jacket and straightened his collar. "But I'm not that kind of black man, Stephen. I never have been, and I never will be. I don't smile and shuffle for anyone's comfort. I tell the truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable. Especially when it makes people uncomfortable." Lee looked out at the audience, many of whom were still sitting in stunned silence. To everyone watching at home, this is what happens when we refuse to be polite about racism. This is what happens when we don't package our pain in ways that make white people feel good about themselves. This is what happens when we demand respect instead of begging for tolerance. He turned back to Colbert one final time. "You want to know what's ungrateful, Stephen? What's ungrateful is expecting black people to be thankful for being disrespected. What's ungrateful is thinking that your platform gives you the right to tell us how to express our experiences. What's ungrateful is believing that your liberal credentials protect you from being called out when you perpetuate the very systems you claim to oppose." With that, Lee began walking toward the exit, his head held high and his stride confident. The cameras followed him as he made his way across the stage, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the silent studio. Colbert, still standing behind his desk, called out desperately, "Spike, wait! We can continue this conversation. We can find common ground." Lee paused at the edge of the stage and turned back one last time. "Common ground, Stephen? The only common ground I'm interested in is the ground where truth meets power. And tonight, you've shown that you're not ready to stand on that ground." Without another word, Spike Lee walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind a stunned audience, a devastated host, and a moment that would be remembered as one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. The cameras continued to roll as Colbert stood alone on the stage, the weight of what had just happened settling over the studio like a heavy blanket. The interview that was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance had become something far more significant. A raw, unfiltered examination of race, privilege, and power in America, and a reminder that some voices refuse to be silenced, no matter how uncomfortable their truth might be.